Out on the high plains of Wyoming, the Union Pacific Big Boy number 40 or 14 steam locomotive was belching out a sky-blackening plume of smoke like a waking iron leviathan. This 1.2 million pound industrial miracle, driven by nothing but coal and boiling water, was right in the middle of its annual commemorative tour. 5 miles down the line, an alien interceptor had just touched down, unleashing a massive electromagnetic pulse designed to brick every piece of modern tech within a 100-mile radius. The alien commander watched with smug satisfaction as the radar showed every human aircraft and electric train instantly going dead, fully convinced Earth's transportation arteries were severed for good. Back in the sweltering cab, though, veteran engineer Hank only noticed his radio suddenly cutting out to static. He gave the steam whistle a yank, completely oblivious to the electromagnetic assault. Against this pure mechanical beast, devoid of a single microchip, the alien EMP was an absolute joke. Accompanied by a deafening shriek from the whistle and the ground-shaking roar of steel, the big boy hurtled forward at 60 miles an hour, packing catastrophic physical momentum as it barreled straight toward the fragile energy blockade. The half-inch solid cast steel cowcatcher bit into the blinding blue light first. Hank's calloused knuckles went dead white around the throttle. Unwelded wrenches and oil cans launched into the air inside the cab, clattering violently against the scorching steel floor. An ear-shredding shriek of rupturing capacitors exploded across the tracks. That energy blockade, designed to stall out an entire modern armored convoy, shattered like a frozen windowpane against 1.2 million pounds of terrifying kinetic fury. 1,000 blue fractures spiderwebbed from the point of impact before the entire force field collapsed, splintering into countless glowing shards that pelted the locomotive's iron boiler like hail in the slipstream. Hank didn't back off the throttle a single inch. He glanced at the steam gauge. The needle bounced twice before pegging right back in the red zone, then squinted out at his front end. Seeing a little paint scraped off the cowcatcher's edge, his face darkened into a scowl. The colossal impact of smashing through the energy wall didn't bleed off an ounce of momentum. The shockwave traveled down the twin rails like invisible lightning, shooting straight into the belly of the alien interceptor, parked 300 yards down the line. The warship's alloy deck instantly erupted into a frantic, high-frequency vibration. Every holographic tactical display lining the bridge blew out into violent static, while heavy control panels tore loose from their dampener mounts and violently launched into the air. The violent tremor pitched Commander Zara right out of his anti-grav command chair. His tactical gloves skidded across the slick alloy decking, leaving 2 black streaks before his spine slammed brutally against the edge of an airborne control panel. The impact nearly knocked the air right out of his lungs. Hauling himself off the deck, he looked up to find his holographic tactical arrays completely drowned in chaotic white noise. The bright blue polygon marker that once represented the energy blockade was gone. Erased. Frantically, he mashed the backup sensor terminal on his wrist, bypassing the compromised bridge mainframe to pull external telemetry. Seconds later, a pale blue data stream materialized over his arm. The feedback from the probe modules practically made his retinas twitch. The colossal metallic vehicle barreling down the rails was emitting 0 trackable electromagnetic signatures. It housed no plasma propulsion modules. It didn't even register the faint radiation bleed of a rudimentary microprocessing chip. Zara pulled up the EMP effectiveness report. The words "zero impact" glared in blood red against the black void of the screen. His full-yield pulse generator had bricked every cell phone, car, and drone in the Wyoming Badlands. It had fried the early warning radar at an Air Force base 200 miles away into molten slag. Yet its effect on this smoke-belching relic's mobility was absolute zero, precise to 12 decimal places. A profound alien chill crept up Zara's spine. He had conquered 7 primitive civilizations, and he had never encountered a machine of war utterly divorced from electronic networking. Every predictive combat model his database held on Earth's capabilities was wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Through the observation port, the soot-choked black smoke was already scraping across the bridge viewports. The moving mountain of iron was now close enough that he could see the shattered gravel kicking up as 16 massive drive wheels hammered over the rail joints. Stumbling, Zara lunged toward the only main console that hadn't completely flatlined. Cold sweat slicking his fingertips, he slammed the ignition for the energy tractor beams. The surviving backup terminals flashed blinding green, and an ear-piercing whine of charging capacitors echoed through the chamber. Ignoring the blood-red overload warnings screaming across the monitors, he barked a top-priority override into the comms. Divert all auxiliary power to the tractor array. Lock onto the target and max out reverse thrust. 2 neon green energy beams, each as thick as a man's torso, lashed out from the interceptor's ventral ports with a crackle of ionization. Like 2 glowing pythons, they coiled violently around the big boy's solid steel buffer beam. The tension readings on Zara's wrist terminal skyrocketed. He gritted his teeth, staring at the numbers. This tractor array was engineered to physically arrest 10-ton interstellar shuttles in mid-escape. Using it on a low-speed planetary land vehicle should have been a godlike display of overkill. But a second later, the blood drained from his face. The tractor load hit 120% of its design threshold. The warship's internal struts began groaning under the immense strain. Looking out through the soot-stained viewport, Zara realized the belching iron behemoth hadn't even kicked up a spark of braking friction. It was still plowing forward at a relentless 60 miles an hour. Pulled by an unfathomable mass of inertia, the green tractor beams began to physically warp, stretching thin like rubber bands ready to snap. Before Zara could even order a power increase, that horrifying counter-drag, far exceeding the structural limits of the tractor array, traveled straight through the locomotive's steel chassis and directly into the palm of Hank's hand on the throttle. Hank's knuckles went bone-white around the throttle handle. The sudden drag biting back at him ground painfully into the thick calluses of his palm. A heavy, sluggish vibration thrummed through the steel deck plates beneath his boots. The speedometer needle shuddered, dropping a solid 3 miles an hour. He threw a glance at the brass boiler gauge bolted to the cab wall. The silver needle was lazily drifting down toward the yellow warning zone. The old-timer blew his stack. He whipped around and hollered at Billy, who was half buried in the tender's coal dust, his gravelly voice fighting the howling Badlands wind. Boiler's losing pressure. Fill her up, damn it. Billy, who had been leaning against the heap wiping sweat, let out a whoop and sprang into action. His massive, ham-sized hands choked up on the polished iron coal shovel. He drove the spade hard into the packed black pile, twisting his wrist to scoop up a heaping mountain of coal. Swinging his arms like a windmill, he didn't even pause for breath. Shovel after shovel, he hurled the greasy black rocks violently into the cherry-red maw of the firebox. Scorching tongues of fire licked out through the firebox door, instantly singeing the hair on his exposed forearms into crispy black curls. Billy didn't even blink. With a heavy clang, the final 20-pound scoop of bituminous coal slammed into the white-hot belly of the boiler. A rolling wave of heat blasted out the hatch, whipping Billy's soot-caked bangs straight back. The needle on the brass pressure gauge shot up like a bat out of hell, burying itself with a sharp click dead against the top of the red line. The metal casing grew so blistering hot you could sear a raw steak right on it. 16 massive 68-inch drive wheels bit down hard into rails already baked by the Wyoming winds. The scattered golden-red sparks grinding off the rims instantly linked up, trailing behind the wheels in one continuous fiery ribbon of light. The horrifying mechanical thrust generated by 540 tons of sheer iron fury surged straight through the chassis and into the locomotive's front beam. The glowing green tractor beams choked around the cowcatcher were suddenly ripped apart by an invisible hand. Dense fractal webs shattered across the energy tethers in a microsecond, the blinding green light strobing frantically like a steel cable seconds from snapping. Billy stabbed his big shovel handle up into the coal dust at his boots. His denim work shirt was soaked black with sweat. He cut his eyes toward the flickering green light outside the cab window, flashing a bright white grin as he spat a colorful string of curses. A split second later, a rapid-fire staccato of popping rivets echoed from the alien interceptor several hundred yards ahead. Pure, unadulterated physical inertia tore the half-ton tractor beam generator cleanly off the warship's hull. It ripped away a huge chunk of alloy armor, exposing sparking blue wires and dangling cables before plunging heavily into the gravel ballast by the rails. The neon green tractor beam, which had barely survived 30 seconds, shattered into a cloud of fluorescent dust, scattering into nothingness on the wind. Without that dead weight holding it back, the big boy's speed violently surged. The speedometer needle jumped to 65 miles an hour. Howling through the wind, the massive cowcatcher aimed straight for the alien ship stranded on the tracks. Showers of electrical sparks erupted across the vibrating metal floor of the bridge. Zara sucked in a sharp breath of agony as the jagged edge of the mangled console dug right back into an old battle wound on his spine. He stared blankly at the scrambled green data cascading down the main holoscreen. The 1.2 million pound iron behemoth that should have been yanked to a dead halt hadn't just ignored the brakes. It had ripped off a tractor beam generator worth half an interstellar frigate, taking half a square meter of reinforced hull armor right along with it. The obscenely expensive, precision-engineered hardware was pulverized into glowing confetti by the locomotive's slipstream before it even hit the ground. His fingers swiped wildly across the translucent interface. Every single pre-programmed anti-vehicular tactical protocol flashed back crimson warnings. There wasn't a single contingency in the entire fleet manual for dealing with a massive, pure iron construct driven completely by burning rocks and boiling water, entirely unreliant on electronic components. The EMP was fully spent. The energy barricade was reduced to atoms. The ship's auxiliary reserves were already depleted by 70%. Weighing in at nearly 10,000 tons, the grounded interceptor simply didn't have enough anti-gravity thrust left to lift itself to a safe altitude within 30 seconds. The blood drained entirely from Zara's silver-blue alien visage. He slammed his fist down on the half-dead control board, roaring out his orders. Blockade Fleet 1st Heavy Infantry Squad. Deploy from the flank airlocks immediately. Form up center line on the tracks. Max power to plasma rifles. Melt its steel wheels down to slag. A second later, 12 bright blue blips representing heavy infantry detached from the ship's coordinates on his wrist terminal. Sliding down the gravity baffles, they hit the dirt, planting themselves firmly on the gravel, and rails of the wind whipped Wyoming badlands. 12 suits of gleaming heavy armor pivoted in absolute synchronization. Muzzles of plasma rifles, glowing with an eerie blue chill, snapped up to aim squarely at the front of the steam locomotive barreling down on them at 65 miles per hour, trailing a hurricane of black smoke. The highly energized plasma within their power coils began shrieking with a high-frequency hum. 12 high-energy plasma beams slammed viciously into the big boy's steel cowcatcher. The top few millimeters of cast iron instantly flashed into cherry-red slag, dripping down the grill and hitting the ballast below with a hissing plume of white steam. Billy stared at the glowing spots for 2 seconds, his brow furrowing hard enough to crush coal. A full power volley from these alien sumbitches couldn't even punch through the 2-inch main armor plate of the cowcatcher. The stray shots that splashed against the massive drive wheels left shallow pockmarks you could scratch off with a fingernail, failing to even breach the tempered wear layer of the rims. Not shedding a fraction of its 65 miles per hour velocity, the 1.2 million pound beast kept stubbornly plowing ahead through the Badlands gale. The brass needles on the instrument cluster stayed dead, pegged to the red line, unmoving. Standing in the center of the tracks, the 12 alien heavy infantrymen could barely hold their footing. The hurricane-force winds rattled the edges of their heavy plates as they gritted their teeth, cranking their plasma rifle thresholds to the absolute max. But the localized heat that could turn a light armored transport into a puddle was completely worthless against this solid iron steam monstrosity. They might as well have been tossing lit matches at the drum of a runaway steamroller. Billy hawked a wad of soot-flecked spit, choking up on his polished iron shovel. He was just about to lean out the front window to check for flying shrapnel when he caught movement in his peripheral vision. Hank had let go of the throttle, had been white-knuckling for 20 minutes. That grease-stained, calloused left hand reached out, grabbing for the emergency blowdown valve bolted to the side of the console, a lever painted fire engine red and locked behind a brass safety clasp. With a sharp click, Hank's rough knuckles popped open the brass safety catch on the blowdown valve. His fingers wrapped tightly around the bright red cast-iron handle. Standing shoulder to shoulder dead center on the tracks, the 12 alien heavy troopers were trembling violently. The charge indicator lights on their plasma rifles burned a blinding, saturated crimson. Pale blue cooling mist began hissing from the weapon casings as they pushed past critical overload, seconds away from discharging plasma beams strong enough to core a main battle tank. Hank let out a sooty scoff. Had been driving steam engines for 42 years. Had seen Wyoming winds that could flip an 18-wheeler and blizzards that buried entire rail lines. He sure as hell wasn't scared of a dozen glowing little green men standing on his railroad ties. Tendons popping in his forearm, Hank yanked the heavy valve handle hard down to the floor. The limiter gears inside the metal valve body snapped with a crunch like shattering ice. 400-degree high-pressure steam, bottled up in the cylinders for hours, violently slammed into the lateral exhaust ports. The needle on the brass boiler gauge pinged clear past the red line. A skin-searing vibration traveled straight up the valve handle and into Hank's palm. The entire chassis of the big boy hummed with a low, predatory rumble, drowning out even the thunder of the drive wheels hammering the joints. Hank reached up, yanking his leather goggles down over his eyes. He locked his gaze squarely on the row of alien infantrymen, whose eyes were already blowing wide open in sudden panic. Boom! The hyper-pressurized pocket of blinding white steam detonated. 400 degrees of pressurized, boiling vapor violently evacuated through the locomotive's lateral blowdown valves. It swept outward just above the tracks like a blindingly white, moving wall of death. The 4 alien troopers in the front rank didn't even get a chance to pull their triggers. Superheated steam instantly blinded their optical sensors. Their thermal imaging lenses melted into a foggy haze. Before they could even raise a hand to tear off their visors, a hyper-pressurized thermal shockwave blasted through the seams of their armor and flooded their circulation systems. Cooling loops fractured from the extreme heat. Condensation hit overloaded circuits, completely bricking their heavy suits on the spot. Hundreds of pounds of heavy infantry were batted aside like they'd been hit by a battering ram. They were launched 10 feet into the air, hurled sideways for over 60 feet, and slammed lifelessly into the sagebrush along the embankment. Their overloaded plasma rifles clattered against the scorching rocks, hissing blue smoke. The remaining 8 troopers froze dead in their tracks. The billowing steam wave was still rolling outward, packing enough ambient heat to melt rubber. It forced them to stagger backwards, their boots grinding harsh scrapes into the gravel ballast. 2 of the panicked grunts squeezed their triggers blindly. Max yield plasma blasts wildly skimmed over the big boy's roof, blooming into brief flashes of blue fire high above the Badlands. Hank's white-knuckled grip held the throttle steady, his goggles strapped tight over his nose. He even freed up a hand to pat the side of the boiler. The roaring old gal wasn't shuddering an inch. The brass gauge was solidly pinned at the edge of the red line, and the speedometer needle was still slowly inching upward. As the wind whipped the dissipating steam to the sides, he got a crystal-clear look at the bulging, terrified eyes behind the remaining 8 aliens' visors. Dense layers of condensation slicked the casings of their plasma rifles, while their overloaded red indicators strobed wildly like dying fireflies. On the bridge's main display, the 4 tactical blips representing the vanguard infantry abruptly flatlined. Every shred of telemetry, GPS positioning, and vital signs streaming from their armor dissolved into dancing static. Zara hissed through his teeth as the vibrating console gnawed once more into his injured back. His fingernails dug fiercely into the searing touch panel. He routed every spare flop of processing power not tied down by the anti-grav engines straight into his top-tier Omni hacking suite. The interstellar blockade fleet had subjugated 73 galaxies, and no mechanical vehicle had ever escaped their remote override under a full-spectrum EMP blanket. Pale blue intrusion algorithms cascaded furiously across his holoscreen, sweeping through preset breach protocols. Power core control units, braking feedback modules, autopilot hubs. Every query returned a null value. The raw specs that populated the screen made Zara's irises uncontrollably contract, coal-fired boiler core temperature sitting at 1270 degrees Celsius. Brass pressure gauge pegged hard into the red. Piston crank bars reciprocating at 120 cycles per minute. High-pressure steam lines at 420 psi. No circuit boards. No microchips. Not a single digital access port to interface with. His blood ran ice cold as he stared at those purely physical parameters. A profound existential crisis finally hit him. This metal leviathan's control systems were never housed in any network. It was utterly, purely hard-locked by the grinding of gears, the strain of muscle, and the sheer combustion of coal. His top-of-the-line intrusion software, upgraded to the tune of hundreds of millions of credits, couldn't do jack shit against a pile of cast iron and boiling water. Horrified, he watched the remaining 8 infantry blips on the screen. 4 of them, pushing through the lingering heat of the steam burst, retreated into the blind spot on the train's flank. High tensile grapples fired from their wrists, latching onto the train's steel catwalk railings with a sharp clack. The lead trooper gripped the rail, hoisting half of his glowing visor over the edge. Billy heard the sharp clack of a grapple biting the steel railing just past his ear. Before he even turned his head, his palm naturally slapped around the handle of the polished iron coal shovel leaning by the firebox. Muscles bulging under his soot-stained arms, Billy hefted the 30-pound spade. Using the bouncing momentum of the locomotive, he swung it horizontally like a baseball bat. The alien infantryman, whose glowing visor had just cleared the edge of the cab, didn't even have a split second to raise his plasma rifle. The heavy iron spade cracked dead center against his faceplate. Clang. The explosive impact was so loud, it rattled the rust off the cab siding. The alien's neck armor, visibly deformed on the spot. The sheer brute force ripped the metal clasp of his wrist grapple cleanly apart. Launched like a line drive, the trooper sailed laterally into the gravel berm. blasting waist-high fragments of granite into the air before lying motionless. Billy shook out his hand, the recoil still stinging the webbing of his thumb. Sweat and coal dust cut dark streaks down his cheeks. As he glanced back up, he caught sight of the remaining 3 troopers dangling from the railing. They were swinging their boots up, stepping right onto the steel gangway between the engine and the tender. For decades, that steel gangway had been coated in leaking lubricating oil and a fine dusting of soot blown back from the firebox. It was as slick as if someone had hosed it down with liquid graphite. The anti-slip modules on the aliens' hover boots were calibrated strictly for high-alloy starport decks. They possessed absolutely zero friction parameters for an oil and soot slurry. The instant the first boot planted, it violently washed out. The soldier didn't even have time to finish a scream before his center of gravity pitched backward toward the wheel housing. The 2 grunts behind him couldn't stop their momentum. Shoulders colliding hard, all 3 glowing blue figures tumbled over each other in a tangled heap right off the gangway and down into the undercarriage. Amid the roaring thump of the boiler pistons churning at 120 beats a minute, Billy listened to the sickening crunches echoing up from beneath the wheels. The vibrations shook loose coal dust right off the gangway plates. 3 heavily armored suits flashing malfunction reds didn't even last half a second. They were squashed into metal foil down in the gaps of the railroad ties by 68-inch, solid cast steel drive wheels. Only a single dropped plasma rifle bounced twice across the gangway before clattering harmlessly into the ballast. Wiping a smear of coal dust from his eye with his sleeve, Billy checked the locomotive's blind spot. The last 4 alien troopers had completely lost their formation, firing swagger. Stumbling back a dozen paces, their spines hit the protruding bow of their grounded interceptor. Standing right between the 2 steel rails, they had nowhere left to run. Hank hadn't let up his death grip on the throttle for a second. The Badlands wind whipped through his open collar, violently flapping his soot-stained coveralls. He shot a glance down the tracks at the last 4 alien heavies backed against a wall. Pinned squarely against the interceptor's cold bow, they were practically hovering over the ballast. The overload warning lights on their 4 plasma rifles were strobing into a continuous blur of panicked red. The weapon casings were getting so hot they were actually beginning to warp and soften. Showing absolutely zero signs of slowing down, the 62 miles per hour Iron Beast closed the gap in a heartbeat, its cowcatcher riding a wave of golden red sparks. The vanguard infantryman shrieked and ripped his trigger back. The overloaded plasma beam scraped across the cowcatcher's armor, plating, kicking up a dusting of iron shavings. A split second later, several tons of cast iron smashed squarely into his chest. He didn't even manage a complete scream. Along with the other 3 troopers frantically trying to claw their way up the ship's hull, he was scooped up by the unforgiving steel plow and fed directly beneath the carriage. The sickening thud of 68-inch cast steel drive wheels grinding over heavy armor sent a vibration up to the cab that made the brass gauges buzz. In under 2 seconds, there wasn't a single alien infantryman left standing on the tracks. A 12-man elite heavy squad, trained for a decade by the interstellar blockade fleet, along with 4 plasma rifles pushed to the brink of critical meltdown, had all been reduced to shiny metal scraps jammed between the railroad ties. On the holographic tactical screen, the final bright green dot representing heavy infantry abruptly dissolved into corrupted pixels. 12 consecutive flatline alerts rang out through the bridge like a rapid-fire death knell. The jagged edge of the vibrating console bit mercilessly into Zara's wounded back. A sharp spike of pain shot straight up his spine to the crown of his skull. His bloodless face violently twitched, his irises shrinking to involuntary pinpricks. The rangefinder readouts blinked frantically on the only half-functional monitor left, 297 yards, a number that was shrinking at a terrifying 27 meters per second. His Omni hacking suite, boosted by 7 times its normal processing power, was utterly worthless. The EMP aftershock had melted every piece of electronics for miles to slag, yet hadn't shaved a single yard per second off that steam engine's velocity. The tractor beam generator had been forcefully amputated from the hull. Up until this very second, he still couldn't wrap his head around how humanity used nothing but boiling water and burning rocks to fashion a moving metallic mountain that completely defied physical reason. A hysterical, broken roar tore from his throat. Lunging over the control panel, his fingertips dug into the rubber grips of the anti-gravity engine throttle. He violently shoved the thick metal lever dead against the top of its track. The anti-grav thrusters beneath the hull instantly erupted in a blinding blue-white torrent of flame. The entire interceptor, wedged sideways across the tracks, began to hum with a deafening resonance. Blue-purple electrical sparks sprayed from the hull seams. The structural tension readouts holding the ship to the rails plummeted rapidly. Just 3 more seconds of thrust accumulation, and the warship would vault vertically into the sky, safely clear of the path of that spark-spewing steel monstrosity. Zara's knuckles flushed a sickly pale green from the strain. He stared obsessively as the lift progress bar jumped to 87%. His tightly drawn mouth even managed to twitch into a fleeting illusion of survival. Then, an intake overload alarm viciously shattered the hum of the bridge, shrieking at the top of its digital lung. Zara's eardrums ached from the sudden shrieking blast of the intake alarm. His eyes locked frantically onto the cascading data streams of the holoscreen. It was only then that he saw it. The sky-blackening coal soot belched out by Big Boy number 4014. Over the past 30 seconds had already blanketed the low-altitude airspace around the interceptor in an airtight cloud of smog. When the anti-grav thrusters sucked in air at maximum capacity, a full half-pound of soot mixed with coarse, gritty coal cinders was drawn straight into the engine's cooling intakes. It instantly choked the delicate turbine radiator fins. The 87% lift progress bar was chopped dead in its tracks. The numbers nose-diving drastically, 81%, 64%, 37%. Barely lifting a meter off the ground, the anti-grav engines choked out a sickening, metallic stall. The blue-white exhaust flame instantly snuffed out. With a thunderous crash, hundreds of tons of interceptor slammed right back down onto the tracks. The alloy landing claws on the underbelly drove themselves brutally into the gaps between the rails, anchoring the ship down to the millimeter. Zara's spinal wound cracked against the console edge again. Vision going black from the agony, he fought through the pain to slap the weapon system ignition switch, only to realize a bitter truth. When the tractor beam generator had been ripped clean off 30 seconds ago, it dragged the main weapon array's power bus right out with it. The entire command board was as dead as a piece of scrap iron. With trembling eyes, he looked up at the main monitor. Spewing a torrential cloud of black smoke, the big boy was steamrolling over the final few dozen yards of track at 62 miles per hour. The brass steam whistle at its head was fully charged with 420 psi of high-pressure steam, the metal casing physically vibrating under the sheer internal pressure. Hank hooked 2 fingers into the pull ring of the brass whistle and yanked it down hard. Charged with 420 psi of boiling steam, the whistle unleashed a bone-rattling bellow that sent pain shooting through the eardrums. The heavy wall of sound rolled across the Wyoming Badlands, sweeping up soot and vibrating the very gravel beside the rails. Hank hadn't moved a fraction of a finger toward the brake lever. Hauling heavy rail for 40 years, he knew better than anyone that a behemoth in the big boy's weight class needed a full mile to stop. Hitting the brakes now wouldn't do a damn thing except shave down the tread on his drive wheels. He snapped down his frayed leather goggles and death gripped the cast steel grab rail of the cab, squeezing so hard his fingertips turned white. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught Billy driving one last massive scoop of coal into the belly of the beast. The roiling golden-red firelight spilled out the firebox door, illuminating the thick coats of soot on both their faces. The brass needle on the speedometer stayed bolted to the 62 miles per hour hash mark. The dual-stroke per second shudder of the piston cranks crawled right up from the steel floorboards and into their bones. The thunderous clack-clack of the drive wheels beating the rails grew heavier, sounding off like the drumming heartbeat of a prehistoric monster. 30 yards ahead, the cold alloy hull of the paralyzed alien interceptor completely filled the front windshield. The massive steel cowcatcher at the front of the train showed absolutely zero signs of slowing down. Hank's fingers locked onto the cast iron rail so hard the skin looked ready to bleed. His leather goggles dug tightly into his eye sockets, while the skull-rattling echo of the brass whistle snaked down his collar along with the soot. At 62 miles an hour, 30 yards isn't a distance, it's a blink. The rivet-studded, massive steel cowcatcher took a brutal bite right out of the interceptor's cold superalloy flank. A teeth-grinding shriek of tearing metal ripped through the howling Badlands wind. The proud hull armor of an advanced alien civilization was about as tough as tinfoil against the pure inertia of a 1.2 million pound iron beast. The blunt face of the cowcatcher plowed a massive, 2-foot-wide gash straight through the plating. Blinding arcs of light erupted as sparks mixed violently with spurting blue-green coolant. The big boy's piston cranks kept cycling like mad at 120 beats a minute. The speedometer needle was welded to 62, refusing to flinch or drop a single digit. Anchored to the rails by its own landing claws, the interceptor couldn't budge an inch. Its structural keel began snapping and crunching like a soggy cracker. The entire warship violently buckled and broke clean in half, right down the middle. Shrapnel and shredded alloy chunks were launched 50 feet into the air, raining down like shrapnel across the ballast on both sides. Through the tempered glass of the windshield, Hank could clearly see Commander Zara, who had been launched out of his chair onto his command deck. The alien's combat suit was shredded and bleeding in several spots, his ribcage visibly warped out of shape. Every holographic panel around him was popping with electrical fire. As the massive locomotive pushed onward, the load-bearing steel struts of the bridge ceiling let out a dying groan. Trailing shattered glass, they crashed down viciously toward the top of Zara's head. The falling beam barely grazed the edge of his helmet before smashing into the metal deck of the console. Splashing sparks seared Zara's skin, causing him to gasp in agony while the excruciating pain of his snapped ribs nearly shredded his consciousness. Cradling his mangled chest, he dragged himself back toward the captain's chair. His fingers scrambled blindly across the cracked upholstery until they finally hooked around the cold, hard edge of the ejection trigger. Head assumed this physically triggered emergency life support pod was dead the moment the main power bus got ripped out. Miraculously, the catastrophic impact of the train had jostled the safety pin right off the capacitor bank. Summoning the absolute last ounce of his strength, he mashed the button down. A rapid sequence of muffled directional explosive charges fired off. The translucent life support pod encased him and violently blew through the buckling roof of the bridge, rocketing into the stratosphere like a cannonball. G-forces pressed into his chest, making his eyeballs bulge. Peering down through the pod's viewport, he had a crystal-clear view of the 1.2 million pound steam beast. It was pushing the bisected wreckage of his interceptor right down the tracks, not slowing down for a damn thing. Scalding black smoke dragged a long, triumphant tail across the Badlands horizon. Trembling, numb fingers reached for the highest priority quantum communicator on his wrist. The second the channel opened, he didn't waste a microsecond. Cramming every bizarre, logic-defying parameter that violated the entire Starfleet tactical database into one hysterical, despairing alert, he screamed, "The Earthlings possess an unstoppable, massive yield dark matter kinetic weapon." The moment the words left his mouth, Zara's head slumped to the side as he blacked out completely. Dragging a pale blue ionization trail, his pod vanished into the black void of low Earth orbit. He was completely blind to the fact that down below, the iron Leviathan's piston cranks were still churning at a relentless 120 cycles a minute. High-pressure steam at 420 psi still hummed with a deep resonance through its pipes. Pushing a 2-foot chunk of superalloy wedged into its cowcatcher, the train continued dragging the back half of the warship down the rails on a hellbound run. The back half of the alien interceptor, thoroughly impaled on the cowcatcher, scraped a 2-foot-wide scorched trench into the ballast. Cold, blue fragments of superalloy showered violently over the front of the locomotive, hooking themselves onto railings and handholds. The 16 massive drive wheels kept up their brutal 120 beat-per-minute rhythm, carrying 540 tons of iron fury toward the end of the line. 2 miles of rail were eaten up and spit out in a matter of seconds. From the front console, Hank let out a gravelly holler. Billy barely turned his head before he heard the sharp, heavy clack of the brake lever being thrown hard to the stops. Thick cast-iron brake shoes slammed viciously against the rims of the drive wheels. A bone-jarring shriek of metal on metal erupted. Superheated, neon-orange sparks sprayed horizontally from the rims, trailing 2-foot tongues of fire into the dry Badlands gale. Billy's boots slipped out from under him, sending him stumbling forward. He only caught his balance by death gripping his coal shovel, the heavy spade slamming into the pile and kicking up a spray of fine cinders. The speedometer needle finally broke from the 62 miles per hour mark, plunging fast. The thunderous clack, clack, clack of the chassis slowed to a crawl. Finally, the piston crank bars ground through one last agonizing stroke, letting out a hum as deep as distant thunder. The big boy, still wearing the mangled superalloy carcass on its cowcatcher, finally came to a dead, absolute halt in the middle of the tracks. Wind whipped hot, soot-laced steam back into the cab. Billy wiped at the zebra-striped sweat and dirt on his cheek, looking up just in time to see Hank slapping a hand against the warped iron door of the cab. Dropping his weight, Hank threw his shoulder into the warped iron door. With a groaning snap, it gave way, dropping a handful of rust flakes as it clanged heavily against the footboards. A wave of hot, soot-choked steam rolled over him. Yanking his leather goggles down over his eyes, he hopped down the worn steps and hit the gravel ballast, his heavy work boots kicking up a cloud of stone dust. Billy swung down right behind him, still resting that polished iron coal shovel casually over his shoulder. Streaks of coal dust and sweat painted thick war paint across his cheeks, and the webbing of his thumb was still twitching from slinging dozens of pounds of coal. He was just opening his mouth to ask if they should go check on the bisected alien wreckage burning out behind them, but Hank didn't even spare a glance for the crackling sea of fire. Without turning his head, the old man marched straight to the front of the big boy. Lifting a soot-stained canvas work glove, Hank fiercely wiped at a gnarly 6-inch scratch across the top of the cowcatcher. His fingers dragged through a thick puddle of glowing neon blue alien coolant, which immediately hissed and burned a few tiny holes in his glove. Hank sucked in a breath of pure heartbreak. He spun around, hollering at Billy over the howling Badlands wind. Son of a bitch. These glow-in-the-dark assholes just scratched the hell out of our centennial commemorative paint job. The brass down at Union Pacific pinched pennies for 3 years for this restoration. The dispatch chief is going to chase my ass down 3 city blocks for this. Billy let out a belly laugh. His boot accidentally kicked a hard chunk of metal in the dirt. Reaching down, he picked up one of the overloaded, blistering hot plasma rifles dropped in the ballast earlier. He weighed it in his hand, then casually tossed it into a storage bin on the tender. "Ain't no sweat, old man. Well, just mount this shiny piece of junk on the front grille for decoration. Tell him it's a brand new aftermarket upgrade for old 4014. I'd like to see anybody tell us otherwise." Hank didn't answer. He just reached up and rapped his knuckles against the brass boiler gauge. The needle was resting comfortably in the safe zone, perfect condition. He looked out down the empty tracks stretching endlessly toward the horizon, the wind carrying their coal smoke into the wild blue yonder without a single damn obstacle in sight. Meanwhile, 30,000 feet up in low Earth orbit, Commander Zara had just regained consciousness. With broken, trembling fingers, he broadcasted a maximum threat alert to the mothership command. "Unknown massive dark matter kinetic weapon is still charging. Threat level maximum." The transmission sent the entire captainry of the interstellar blockade fleet into a collective existential meltdown. Not a single one of them could fathom that their invincible armada, which had laid waste to 7 galaxies, was just stonewalled on a dirt-track railroad by an antique coal-burning train. Back down on the rails, Hank flipped the iron hatch of the firebox wide open. He shot Billy a sharp chin nod, signaling him to shovel in some fresh rock. He yanked the brass whistle, sending a low, heavy, thundering blast rolling out across the wild plains in every direction. Scratched paint or no scratched paint, this train damn sure wasn't going to be late.
Finishing this story, the overwhelming feeling I'm left with is a deep appreciation for heavy metal romance. In modern sci-fi, we are so used to seeing fleets trading plasma fire, quantum shields, and complex cyber warfare. But it made me wonder, if we strip away all the networks, microchips, and advanced tech, what is humanity's most primal, unapologetic, and unreasonable force? The answer is pure physical mass and absolute kinetic energy. That is exactly why the big boy number 4014 became the true protagonist of this story. It is not just a steam locomotive, it is the muscle memory of early human industrial civilization. It's an iron leviathan that doesn't rely on a single line of code, fueled entirely by boiling water, burning coal, and the mechanical grinding of gears. Commander Zara's absolute psychological breakdown is the core of the narrative. He wields EMPs that can black out entire states and algorithms that can hijack any digital network, but he never calculated that on this seemingly primitive dirtball, there are machines that do not speak binary, they only speak inertia. The characters of Hank and Billy perfectly embody that inherent, gritty stubbornness of humanity. Faced with an apocalyptic alien invasion, they couldn't care less about some interstellar blockade fleet. Their only concerns are maintaining boiler pressure and protecting their centennial commemorative paint job. The collision between this grease-stained, blue-collar grit and the sterile, precise superiority of alien tech creates the ultimate contrast and a deeply satisfying dark humor. By the end, picturing that antique train dragging the bisected wreckage of an alien warship on its cowcatcher, yet still blasting its whistle, determined to run on time, felt right. I think it is the perfect tribute to the messy, hot-tempered, yet entirely indestructible resilience of the human spirit.